Wow, what a day it has been so far. Pope Francis has come out very forcefully against the Trump administration, against JD Vance, on the question of immigration that he wrote in a letter to the bishops of the United States of America. Pope Francis has taken the time out to write a very, very formal letter to the bishops of the United States, weighing in on the question of immigration policies with Trump, and also the recent controversy surrounding JD Vance and some comments that he made about the Ordo Amoris, as it's called, the Order of Love, which certainly relates to the question of immigration. Pope Francis has come out explicitly refuting JD Vance's position, which is somewhat awkward since JD Vance identifies as a Catholic, and now the Pope has come out and formally refuted and repudiated his position and has spoken again against the current administration's policies. We're going to take a look at the letter. It's not very long, so we're going to read the whole thing. Then we're going to take a look at Pope Francis's own policies concerning the Vatican. Then we are going to examine a new appointment that he just made for the Archdiocese of Detroit, because it's certainly relevant to this issue of immigration. After that, we're going to take a look at people who are offering critical comments of Pope Francis and others who are offering comments in favor of what Pope Francis has said. So I'm going to show you those who are critical of him and those who are completely on board with what he has said in this letter. So all of that is what's coming up today. But before we dive in, let me remind you, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button. It helps out this channel tremendously. Let's go ahead and dive into the letter. Like I said, it's not very long. So let's just read through the whole thing. Share my screen, and you should be able to see it right around now. Letter of the Holy Father Francis to the bishops of the United States of America. So this is a formal letter that he's writing to the bishops. There's not many of these from Pope Francis to the United States bishops. So whenever he does this, it's something that's really, really, really important to Pope Francis. Okay. So he says, "Dear brothers in the episcopate," maybe zoom in a little bit more on that. "I'm writing today to address a few words to you in these delicate moments that you are living as pastors of the people of God who walk together in the United States of America. The journey from slavery to freedom that the people of Israel traveled, as narrated in the book of Exodus, invites us to look at the reality of our time, so clearly marked by the phenomenon of migration as a decisive moment in history to reaffirm not only our faith in God, who is always close, incarnate, migrant, and refugee, but also the infinite and transcendent dignity of every human person." He says, "These words with which I begin are not an artificial construct. Even a cursory examination of the church's social doctrine emphatically shows that Jesus Christ, the true Emmanuel, he did not live apart from the difficult experience of being expelled from his own land because of an imminent risk to his life, and from the experience of having to take refuge in a society and culture foreign to his own." Just quick question. When Jesus did that, was it illegal? I don't know. But something to consider. The Son of God, in becoming man, also chose to live the drama of immigration. I like to recall, among other things, the words with which Pope Pius XII began his apostolic constitution on the care of migrants, which is considered the Magna Carta of the Church's thinking on migration. Pope Pius XII says, the family of Nazareth in exile, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, immigrants in Egypt, and refugees there to escape the wrath of an ungodly king, are the model, the example, and the consultation or consolation of immigrants and pilgrims of every age and country, of all refugees of every condition who besets by persecution, or who, beset by persecution or necessity, are forced to leave their homeland, beloved family, and dear friends for foreign lands. So Pope Francis now continues. Likewise, Jesus Christ, loving everyone with a universal love, educates us in the permanent recognition of the dignity of every human being without exception. So Pope Francis believes this is an issue of human dignity. In fact, he says, when we speak of infinite and transcendent dignity, we wish to emphasize that the most decisive value possessed by the human person surpasses and sustains every other juridical consideration that can be made to regulate life in society. Thus, all the Christian faithful and people of goodwill are called upon to consider the legitimacy of norms and public policies in the light of the dignity of the person and his or her fundamental rights, not vice versa. Pope Francis continues, I have followed closely the major crisis that is taking place in the United States with the initiation of a program of mass deportations. So he's saying he's following the situation very closely, which is surprising to me because I've always been under the impression that Pope Francis is not very well in tune with what is going on in the world or even in the United States. But he's saying, at least on this particular issue, he's been following it very closely. He says, the rightly formed conscience cannot fail to make a critical judgment and express its disagreement with any measure that tacitly or explicitly identifies the illegal status of some migrants with criminality. Did you hear that? The rightly formed conscience, he says, cannot fail to make a critical judgment and express its disagreement with any measure that tacitly or explicitly identifies the illegal status of some migrants with criminality. So he's saying, even though they came to the United States illegally, they're not criminals. Now, a lot of people are going to push back on that and say, well, by definition, if you're breaking the law, if you're doing something illegally, you're a criminal. Now, whether or not you should be prosecuted for that crime, different question. But by definition, if somebody breaks the law, that would make them a criminal. But what he's saying is, no, even if you break the law, you're not a criminal. Okay, that's his perspective. That's what he's communicating here. And he's saying the Christian conscience cannot conclude that a person who breaks the law in this manner is a criminal. He says, at the same time, one must recognize the right of a nation to defend itself and keep communities safe from those who have committed violent or serious crimes while in the country or prior to arrival. That said, the act of deporting people who in many cases have left their own land for reasons of extreme poverty, insecurity, exploitation, persecution, or serious deterioration of the environment damages the dignity of many men and women and of the entire families and places them in a state of particular vulnerability and defenselessness. So he's saying, people who have not committed violent crimes but have come here illegally because they're trying to escape extreme poverty and issues of exploitation and persecution, those people should not be deported, he says. He says this is not a minor issue. An authentic rule of law is verified precisely in the dignified treatment that all people deserve, especially the poorest and most marginalized. The true common good is promoted when society and government, with creativity and strict respect for the rights of all, as I have affirmed on numerous occasions, welcomes, protects, promotes, and integrates the most fragile, unprotected, and vulnerable. This does not impede the development of a policy that regulates orderly and legal migration. However, this development cannot come about through the privilege of some and the sacrifice of others. What is built on the basis of force and not on the truth about the equal dignity of every human being begins badly and will end badly. He continues, Christians know very well that it is only by affirming the infinite dignity of all that our own identity as persons and as communities reaches its maturity. Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interest. Now, listen to this because this is the part where he's explicitly attempting to refute J.D. Vance, a professed Catholic, the vice president of the United States, who has come out and spoken of Christian love and the order of love, Ordo Amoris, as it's called in Latin. He has recently spoken about this and how the order of love, first of all, obligates us to love those people who are immediately around us, then our neighbor, and then in a broader scale. And this is actually something that goes back to Thomas Aquinas. Some argue it also goes back to the Bible. So now, because of that controversy, J.D. Vance was trying to point to that, to note that, well, first of all, our duties are first and foremost to our own and then to others. He was trying to point that out. A lot of people were in favor of what he was saying. Others were pushing back against it. Now Pope Francis is going to push back hard against J.D. Vance and is going to attempt to refute him. So here's what he says. Christians know very well it's only by affirming the infinite dignity of all that our own identity as persons and communities reaches its maturity. Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests that little by little extend to other persons and groups. In other words, the human person is not a mere individual, relatively expansive, with some philanthropic feelings. The human person is a subject with dignity, who, through the constitutive relationship with all, especially with the poorest, can gradually mature in his identity and vocation. The true Ordo Amoris, there's the term that J.D. Vance used, so it's explicitly clear Pope Francis is putting J.D. Vance on blast. The true Ordo Amoris that must be promoted is that which we discover by meditating constantly on the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is, by meditating on the love that builds a fraternity open to all without exception. So that is what he's saying in response to J.D. Vance. Some might argue it doesn't properly interact with his position or with the doctrine to begin with. Others are cheering this on and are completely in favor of it. I do wonder what J.D. Vance is thinking at this moment. I certainly imagine it's quite awkward being a professed Catholic and having the Pope come out and undermine you in this kind of way, in such a very formal way. All right, he continues, but worrying about personal, community, or national identity, apart from these considerations, easily introduces an ideological criterion that distorts social life and imposes the will of the strongest as the criterion of truth. I recognize your valuable efforts, dear brother bishops of the United States, as you work closely with migrants and refugees, proclaiming Jesus Christ and promoting fundamental human rights. God will richly reward all that you do for the protection and defense of those who are considered less valuable, less important, or less human. I exhort all the faithful of the Catholic Church. So now he's addressing all Catholics. He exhorts all Catholics and all men of goodwill not to give in to narratives that discriminate against and cause unnecessary suffering to our migrant and refugee brothers and sisters. With charity and clarity, we are all called to live in solidarity and fraternity, to build bridges that bring us closer together, to avoid walls of ignominy, and to learn to give our lives as Jesus Christ gave his for the salvation of all. Let us ask Our Lady of Guadalupe to protect individuals and families who live in fear or pain due to migration and or deportation. May the Virgin Morena, who knew how to reconcile peoples when they were at enmity, grant us all to meet again as brothers and sisters with her embrace, and thus take a step forward in the construction of a society that is more fraternal, inclusive, and respectful of the dignity of all. Fraternally Francis from the Vatican on the 10th of February, so released yesterday. Very formally written, like I said, as an actual letter of the Pope to the bishops, numbered here with a nice numbering system, formally signed off by the Pope and dated. I mean, he is just pulling out all of the stops here. I mean, it's interesting. He almost puts this out as a little mini encyclical, right? So it kind of has that vibe to it. So that is what Pope Francis has said so far. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a number of other issues surrounding this situation that some people are going to point towards. Then we're going to take a look at those who are critical of what the Pope has said. And then we're going to take a look at what some people who are in favor of the Pope have just said. So let's take a look at Vatican cracking down on illegal entry into its own territory. Some people are going to point to this and say, well, the Pope is being hypocritical. Others are saying, no, it's not hypocritical. It's apples and oranges. And no, Pope Francis recognizes even in that letter that you can have borders and there's a right to security. But what he's talking about is people who are not committing violent crimes. And what this is engaging is people who are committing violent crimes. Well, it's also addressing people who are trespassing, be that as it may. The Vatican City State has toughened sanctions for those who try to illegally enter its territory in areas where free access is not allowed. So the point here is that this is not just for violent criminals. This is just people who illegally enter its territory. And what he did is he increased the penalties for people who do this. So some people are going to say, well, the Pope, in pointing out here in this letter that he's talking about how, yeah, you have a right to defend yourself in cases of non-violent crimes, or violent crimes, but in cases of non-violent activity, they shouldn't be deported and treated as criminals. Others are going to point out, but wait, Pope Francis, you have just increased the penalties for those who illegally enter your territory in the Vatican. And note here, these are penalties, not necessarily with somebody who has committed a violent crime. Obviously, there are penalties for that as well. But this is for trespassing, illegally entering the territory where access is not allowed, even if they don't commit a violent crime. So some people are going to point out that there's a great deal of hypocrisy here. In fact, we're going to see one person, it's actually Trump's border czar sneak peek, who has pointed this out, among others, right? He's not the only one. So this was in a decree issued last month by the Holy See. The monetary sanctions and prison sentences for those who violate the strict security regulations of Vatican City have been considerably increased. And I did a whole video on this already, so y'all are welcome to go and watch it if you want to know more. But I think you get the gist, and I think you understand why some people are pointing to some hypocrisy here. All right. Simultaneous to all of this, the news has just broken today that Pope Francis accepts the resignation of Archbishop Vigneron of the Archdiocese of Detroit and appoints Bishop Edward Weisenberger as successor. Now, why is that important? That he just appointed to the head or to lead Detroit, Edward Weisenberger. Why is that important? Well, because some people are pointing out, well, it was Weisenberger who was calling back in 2018 for Border Patrol agents who were enforcing Trump's border policies, many of them that were the same as under Biden, was calling for these Border Patrol agents to be excommunicated from the Catholic Church and to be forbidden to receive Holy Communion. So, according to the bishop, the article is called Excommunicate Catholics Involved in Immigration Policies 2018. Catholics who implement the Trump administration's hardline asylum rules that separate parents and their children could be kicked out of the church under a proposal floated by Bishop Edward Weisenberger at a gathering of U.S. Catholic bishops. Canonical penalties, which would include everything from withholding sacraments to excommunication, are given for offenses that are seen as more than simply sins, but as crimes according to canon law. So some people are going to point out, okay, well, it's interesting that all of a sudden, in this context, there's discussions about excommunications and withholding communion from individuals. But in other situations, there's no discussion of excommunication or withholding communion. In those cases, what you'll get is bishops who come out and say, well, the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, and we shouldn't politicize the Eucharist. And they'll use that as an argument to say you can't excommunicate people, you can't withhold communion from people. It's interesting that argument doesn't appear to apply when it comes to this situation. In this particular situation, some bishops, like the new Bishop of Detroit, are more than happy to discuss options of excommunicating people, withholding communion from people, and other kind of canonical penalties. Continuing with this, others have pointed out it's also this same bishop who has not too long ago, in addition to a few other bishops that you can see here on the screen, signed this statement called God is on Your Side, a statement from Catholic bishops on protecting LGBT youth that says, as Catholic bishops in the United States, we join with the Tyler Clementi Foundation in standing up for at-risk LGBT youth in our country. As we see in the Gospels, Jesus Christ taught love, mercy, and welcome for all people, especially for those who felt persecuted and marginalized in any way. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches that LGBT people are to be treated with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. All people of goodwill should help support and defend LGBT youth who attempt suicide at much higher rates than the straight counterparts, who are often homeless because of families who reject them, who are rejected, bullied, harassed, and who are targeted of violent and alarming rates. The Catholic Church values the God-given dignity of all human life, and we take this opportunity to say to our LGBT friends, especially young people, that we stand with you and oppose any form of violence, bullying, or harassment directed at you. Most of all, know that God created you, God loves you, and God is on your side. So here we're seeing a very warm welcome message. People who are struggling with this particular sin. The bishop, along with a number of other bishops, are saying, hey, we're here to welcome you. God loves you, and all of that stuff. Now, when it comes to the issue involving the Border Patrol agents, all of the sudden, the welcome facade drops, that mask slips, and now it's no longer a message of welcome. It's a message of we're going to excommunicate and penalize withhold communion. It's a very different tone. So some people are pointing to this on Twitter, among other places, and they're saying, look at the hypocrisy. And again, how does this tie into today's news with Pope Francis? Well, it ties in because not only did it happen today, but clearly part of the reason why Pope Francis made him over an important city like Detroit is because of his very, very stern opposition to Trump's and his administration's policies on immigration. So these two are related. They're not completely independent of each other. This is a move on part of Pope Francis in addition to a letter, but also in appointing bishops to particular important dioceses. This is a move on his part to oppose what Trump is doing. Now, some people who are in favor of Pope Francis and what he has said are such as Gloria Purvis. Here's one thing that she has come out recently saying. She said, when the Holy Father steps in to explain Ordo Amoris, because a recent convert is spreading a false understanding of it, take note and understand that the recent convert is not a trustworthy source for explaining the faith. The Holy Father, the Vicar of Christ, is the trustworthy source. Well, some people are going to say J.D. Vance isn't a recent convert. I think he actually converted in 2018. Others are going to continue to say, yeah, he's a recent convert, and you got to side with the Pope. Others are going to push back and say, well, no, not necessarily, because what the Pope is saying here isn't necessarily magisterial and everything that he said. Others are going to say, yes, it is magisterial. So there's going to be a huge debate on how authoritative that actually is. Austin Ivory has also come out in favor of Pope Francis, saying very unusual for a Pope to do this. So he's picking up on the fact that this is very unusual. Popes don't normally write letters to bishops like this. They do it on occasion, don't get me wrong, but they don't do it very frequently. So this is something very unusual and something very important to Pope Francis. He says magisterial in tone and form, numbered paragraphs, quoting papal teaching, and targeted, referring to Trump policies and Vance's justifications. This letter is meant to leave no doubt about where the church stands. Again, others are going to push back and say, no, it just leaves no doubt on where Pope Francis stands. It doesn't necessarily clarify anything on the magisterium. So there's going to be, again, some debate there. Also still in favor of Pope Francis and what he has said here is Father James Martin, a friend of Pope Francis, controversial bishop in the United States. He came out saying, breaking, Pope sends letter to U.S. bishops decrying mass deportation and rejecting any measure that tacitly or explicitly identifies the illegal status of some migrants with criminality. The true Ordo Amoris, he says, is the ethos of the Good Samaritan, and he shares the letter. In opposition to what Pope Francis has said, border czar Tom Homan rejects Pope Francis's immigration critique. In this video, he's going to say, I've got harsh words for the Pope. The Pope ought to fix the Catholic Church. He wants to attack us securing our border. He has a wall around the Vatican, does he not? So he has a wall to protect his people and himself, but we can't have a wall around the United States. And some are going to say, well, no, he said that you could protect yourself against violent criminals, which, yes, Pope Francis did say that. But then he goes on to say, but the ones who just merely broke the law by being here but are not violent, they should not be penalized. However, again, it has been pointed out that Pope Francis's Vatican does penalize people who illegally enter the Vatican, even if they are not violent in their criminality. Okay, so even with that qualification, people are going to point to that and say there's some hypocrisy. And that's likely where the border czar here is coming from. Let's watch his brief statement. Let me make sure that you can hear that audio.
The Pope this morning had some very harsh words for the...
I got harsh words for the Pope. Pope won't fix the Catholic Church. I'm saying this as a lifelong Catholic. I was baptized Catholic. I was first communion as a Catholic, confirmation as a Catholic. You ought to fix the Catholic Church and concentrate on his work and lead border enforcement to us. He wants to attack us from securing our border. He's got a wall around the Vatican, does he not? So he's got a wall around to protect his people and himself, but we can't have a wall around the United States. So I wish he'd stick to the Catholic Church and fix that and lead border enforcement to us.
All right. So, and this is going to be the sentiment of most people who are critical of what the Pope has said. Also, coming out against Pope Francis is the very controversial priest, another Father James, but not Father James Martin. In this case, it's Father James Altman. He said, you had a F-word problem in the Vatican. You said you had an F-word problem in the Vatican. Speaking of Pope Francis, fix that first and quit butting into another country's right to protect its border like you do. And he says to Pope Francis, you filthy hypocrite. Very much in keeping with his style. Actually, that's probably a little less forceful than what we tend to hear from Father James Altman. But that's his perspective. Again, very critical of what the Pope is saying. So there is a pretty divided perspective here. You know, some are completely in favor of what the Pope is saying. Some are completely against it. Some are somewhere in between. But I do have to point out, in addition to some of the other issues that have been addressed already and perhaps inconsistencies here, I do have to note that it is interesting. We see a letter to the United States bishops from Pope Francis on Trump and his policies on immigration, but I don't recall any letters from Francis to the United States bishops about Biden and his policies on abortion. Now, I do know Pope Francis is opposed to abortion. I just don't recall any letters like this. I do recall when there were some attempts on part of some U.S. bishops to get Biden excommunicated. That was halted by Rome. I do recall that when one of the bishops attempted to penalize Nancy Pelosi, for instance, because of her positions, contrary to the Catholic Church, she was received in Rome and she was allowed to be given communion when the local bishop said she cannot be given communion. So it was clear that Rome allowed for her to receive communion and completely undermined the authority of the local bishop on this matter. So I'll point out that there does appear to be an unbalanced perspective here when it comes to speaking out against political leaders. Also, I think a lot of people are going to conspicuously note that there is a very quick reaction, very quick and swift reaction against Trump, Vance, Catholics who support some of those policies. But there has been silence on some of the other issues involving very troubling bishops and priests in the United States, in addition to other issues with Rome, for instance, dragging its feet on the Rupnik case. Because of situations like that where, okay, there's swift responses and consequences for some things, but then really long delays in others, a lot of people have lost confidence in what the Pope is saying. Whether that's right or wrong, a lot of people have lost confidence. And I think that Pope Francis would be a lot more effective if he was a little more consistent in this kind of discipline, in this kind of reaction, in this kind of refutations, if he was more consistent all around. And also, if he cleaned house with some church affairs first before delving into affairs and politics. Does a pope have the right and authority to speak on matters of politics? The Catholic Church has always taught that the Pope does, and popes always have. But a lot of people are going to point out, but you first have to clean your own house first, get your own house in order first, because if you have a messy house, but then you're telling other people you have to clean your room, clean up your house, they're not going to listen to what you have to say because they're going to say, get your own house in order first. And that's what the Borders are was just saying. And I suspect that's the sentiment of numerous Catholics here in the United States. So, while there might be some points that Pope Francis is making that I think all Catholics have to take to heart, there might be some legitimate points. I think there also might be some legitimate criticisms here. And there also might be some legitimate moments here where people can point to instances of inconsistency. Well, I'd love to hear from y'all. What do you think? You agree with Pope Francis? You disagree? You in favor of what he's saying? Completely against it? You somewhere in between? You think there's some hypocrisy and inconsistency going on? You think that he needs to clean house first, or you think he's already doing a great job at that? I want to hear from you. Put your feedback in the comment section. Let me grab this super chat too. I'll see a few of them. Thank you, Mahovo. He says, this reminds me of when the Second Lateran Council banned use of bows and crossbows against other Christians, and everyone ignored it, and they were Catholics. That's pretty funny. Yeah. Let's see. Yeshua is Lord says, God bless Francis for speaking up for the marginalized. Why is he silent on the plight of believers in Nigeria, Sudan, and the Islamic world? He asks. Okay, thank you for that. Mahoville, thank you. Says, there is just so much talking past each other. ICE is deporting exclusively real criminals and those with multiple deportation orders. And there's going to be a lot of controversy there. Is that actually what's happening? Or are they just indiscriminately deporting just everybody? You know, or is the truth somewhere in the middle? That's a whole show in and of itself. Is the Pope accurately representing the situation? Is he, contrary to what he says, not very well informed on the situation? These things can certainly be debated and will be debated. And I encourage for them to be debated right here in the comment section on this show. Please feel free to do so. Please go ahead and hit that like button. Hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much for tuning in. Got plenty of more great content coming your way. So stay tuned for more. All right. We'll see you next time. God bless. Are you ready to deepen your faith and sharpen your understanding of theology? Welcome to the Center for Theological Research, your gateway to transformative learning. At CTR, you will find in-depth courses designed to equip you with the tools to grow in your understanding of the faith. Explore courses like the 7 Ecumenical Councils and uncover the foundational truths that shape Christianity. Master the ability to determine the level of a doctrine in the Theological Notes course. And in the Logical Fallacies and Apologetics course, you'll learn to spot the logical errors often encountered in non-Catholic apologetics content. Also, check out the ebooks that are available to you for free. Start your journey today. Visit ctresearch.org and take the next step in your faith formation. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the like button, and if you want to support the channel, visit patreon.com/Reason and Theology.